So that was the theme from the film Ginger Snaps, composed by Mike Shields. If you've not seen Ginger Snaps, it's about werewolves, and it's really awesome. I won't say any more than that in case I'm spoiling anyone. But yeah, it's well worth checking out. Right, so it's time for the exclusive now. I'm going to play you the first part of a story written specifically for this show by the author Vivian Oldaker, and it's also read by the author as well, which is very special. So here is part one of the story, and I will let her introduce it.
The Tale of Jonathan Turbot. Jonathan's stepmother was screaming, "Help! Please help! Jonty!" Jonathan sighed and put down his pen. He could guess what she wanted. He left his geography homework and climbed the grand staircase to the first floor, noticing as he did so all the cobwebby corners. Really, it was no wonder the house was full of spiders. His stepmother was waiting outside the bathroom, her velvet housecoat clutched around her thin shoulders. "It's in the bath," her voice shook. "Kill it, please." He never did kill them. Instead, he opened the bathroom window, then scooped up the Tegenario with his bare hands and laid it down gently on the flat roof outside, where it froze for a moment, playing dead, then scuttled off towards next door. "All clear," he said. He couldn't help feeling just a little bit proud of himself. Jonathan Turbot was 11 1/4. Small for his age, timid, neat, fearful, quiet as a mouse, known as Fishy by the boys at school. He hadn't even known that a turbot was a sort of fish until one of the masters told him. His father had certainly never mentioned it. He returned to his homework. Why did anyone who wasn't a Canadian need to know what the Great Lakes of Canada were called? Lake Superior was the biggest and therefore the best. He imagined it glinting in the sunlight, wider, deeper, more mysterious than the other lakes, full of fish, but not turbots which lived in the sea. In times gone by, Red Indians would have canoed over Lake Superior. Canoeing might be fun, but the canoes always looked a bit wobbly and could tip you into the dark depths. Probably Red Indians were taught to swim by the tribe when they were little kids, but still, there might be monsters lurking beneath the surface. "Goodness, haven't you finished that yet?" His stepmother came into the dining room, her hair wrapped up in a toweling turban. The dining room that was going to be made into his father's study. Jonathan wasn't sure why his father needed a study. It wasn't as though he had to do homework, and he had an office at his work. "Turbot Homes, the homes of tomorrow today." His father built houses. He didn't actually do it himself. Other people did it. Bricklayers, carpenters, plumbers, electricians. But his father told them what to do. Turbot homes were everywhere. Semi-detached, small-roomed, narrow-halled, with tiny gardens and thin front doors. His father said they were what people needed, what people wanted. Easy to clean, with space for modern appliances in the kitchen and a choice of linoleum flooring. Mr. Turbot's enthusiasm for these properties was not so great that he chose to live in one himself. Instead, he had recently purchased Huntsman Hall, a run-down mansion that had definitely seen better days. It was Mr. Turbot's grand plan to restore this edifice to its former glory. In the meantime, he, his new wife and his son occupied the few rooms that were habitable. The house came with 5 acres of unkempt grass, a large, less than ornamental pond, and some tired woodland. All this in time would be tamed, manicured, and made suitable for the home of a rich man. Mr. Turbot, round, red-faced, jocular, did not consider himself a gentleman, nor did he aspire to be one. However, he did admire what he thought of as gentlemanly taste, and it was this which would one day surround him and his family, a family which he hoped to expand now that he had remarried following the unfortunate death of his first wife. His second wife was more his sort anyway, though it was rather a pity she took so little interest in the boy. Sometimes Mr. Turbot looked at Jonathan and marvelled that he had produced such a specimen. In his darker moments he even wondered if Diana had been entirely faithful to him. Was the boy really his? Only the chance discovery of a birthmark on Jonathan's abdomen, identical to his own, had put his doubts to rest. "Why don't you go out and play?" Jonathan's stepmother asked him. "I'll get into trouble if I don't finish my homework." "Yes, but it's Saturday tomorrow. You could do it then. The weather might not hold. You should get some fresh air while you can." "Do I have to?" "I think it best. You'd better change out of your uniform first, though." Jonathan's stepmother wanted him out of the house, or at any rate out the dining room, for reasons other than concern for his physical well-being. She wanted to ring someone up, and the only telephone was in the dining room. Having changed his clothes, Jonathan ventured into the rough garden. The summer holidays were soon to start, and while not having to go to school would be a relief, he couldn't think how he was going to fill the 7 long weeks that stretched before him. He liked to make models, but he couldn't do too much of that. His stepmother wouldn't want him indoors all the time. His friend, Simon Potter, was at his old school far away. He could write him a letter, but he couldn't ask him to come to his house to play. His stepmother would never allow it, and it would be rude to ask Potter if he could go to his house. That much he knew. Anyway, Potter probably had other friends now. Jonathan's father had said they might have a holiday to the Costa Brava, which was in Spain, but no definite plans had yet been made. His father wasn't sure he could spare the time. There was a football, a new one, in the long grass. Where on earth had it come from? The only neighbours were old Mrs. Netz and her unmarried niece. They were German, so some people thought they were bad, his father had told him, because of the war. The war had been finished for nearly 20 years, and though the boys at school sometimes played it, a more popular game was Cowboys and Indians. Jonathan had never spoken to Mrs. Netz, had never even seen her, but his stepmother had chatted over the rickety fence that divided the houses to the niece, who was called Susan. Susan was very pretty, with a laugh that made you want to laugh yourself. Jonathan only spoke to her to say good morning on the rare occasions that he saw her on his way to school. The football couldn't be Susan's. Girls didn't play football, and anyway Susan was quite old, at least 25, he guessed. He walked towards the fence and peered through one of the many cracks. Mrs. Netz's house was a small cottage that had, his father said, originally belonged to Huntsman Hall. One day his father planned to buy it back. It could be useful for staff, he said. Susan stood a few feet away, smoking a cigarette, crying. Jonathan didn't know what to do when grown-ups cried. Should he go fetch his stepmother? But she'd been planning a nap and had told him he was not to disturb her. Jonathan moved away and started kicking the ball around the garden. Perhaps he could make some sort of a goal, but it seemed a bit silly when there was no one to defend it. He hated games at school, but here, by himself, he didn't mind trying things like bouncing the ball on his head, balancing it on his leg, things he'd seen other boys do with more or less aplomb. He kicked it high into the air and it went over the fence. Blow! How was he to get it back? He wanted it. If he was ever allowed to have Potter or perhaps another boy to play, it could be useful, and in the meantime he could practice his skills and surprise everyone. He pressed his face to the fence again. Susan was still there. She'd stopped crying and was smoking another cigarette. Jonathan cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said through the gap. "Do you think I could have my ball back?" She started and then turned round to face him. "Oh, you made me jump. Did you say something?" Jonathan repeated his request. "I didn't see it fly over. Why don't you come round and look for it?" She didn't sound cross, which was a relief. Jonathan let himself into the front garden of Huntsman Cottage through the rickety gate. The garden was nearly as shaggy as their own, but here and there some flowers, buzzing with insects, struggled above the weeds. Susan was waiting for him. "You're Jaunty Turbot, aren't you?" She held out her hand. "We haven't been properly introduced. I'm Susan." Jonathan took her hand awkwardly. "Pleased to meet you," he said, in the way that he'd been taught was polite. "Now then," she said, "let's see if we can find this ball, shall we?" They searched the garden. Eventually it was discovered, hidden behind a dustbin. "Here it is," Susan said. "Shall we play? I'll be goalkeeper if you like." She smiled. Gosh, she really was very pretty indeed. Jonathan felt himself blushing. "You really want to play football?" he said, doubtfully. "Of course, why not? It's a lovely afternoon. Tell you what, though, I'll just go change into my pumps." They played for ages. A pair of sycamores made the perfect goal. Susan was a tricky goalie, and her aim, when it was her turn to shoot, was very good. "It's a pity we haven't more players," said Jonty at last. "We could make more of a game of it." "It's quite fun with just the two of us, though, isn't it?" "Oh, yes, it is. I hope you didn't think I was saying it wasn't, because it is." His face was flushing again. "Why don't you come inside for some lemonade?" she said. Jonathan was surprised that the interior of the cottage was, if anything, more dusty and grimy than his own house. How could Susan, who looked so neat and pink and clean, live here? "Sorry about the mess," Susan said, reaching a smeary glass down from a shelf. "It's Auntie. She doesn't like things to be disturbed. Let's take our drinks outside. Would you like a piece of cake? There's some here somewhere." Jonathan liked cake. He couldn't imagine anybody not liking cake, but he didn't like this one. They sat outside under one of the sycamore goalposts, drinking their cloudy lemonade. Jonathan was finding it hard to chew his slice. It was tough and almost leathery, full of bits. It might be what they called seed cake, but he didn't like to ask. Susan seemed to enjoy her piece, and afterwards dabbed at her lips with a small lace handkerchief pulled from the pocket of her slacks. She asked him if he had any plans for the holidays. "Not really, but we might go to Spain. Father says we can drive down in the Humber." "Oh, lucky boy. I shan't go anywhere. I can't leave Auntie." "Rotten luck," said Jonathan sympathetically. "Is she very old?" "Yes, very old," Susan sighed. Jonathan thought that in that case it was possible she might die soon, but he wasn't sure he should say such a thing. "I wonder," said Susan suddenly, "I don't suppose you'd like to earn yourself a bit of pocket money this summer?" "Yes, I would." He wanted to make a diorama of a lake surrounded by trees and snow, a group of Sioux Indians, a wigwam or two, and perhaps with a pack of wolves lurking nearby. He'd need money for materials and paint. "What would I have to do?" he asked. He hoped it wouldn't be gardening. He wasn't much good at that sort of thing. "Oh, just sit with Auntie. Keep an eye on her for a couple of hours, perhaps 2 or 3 times a week. I'd so like to be able to go to the shops or the pictures, or even for a walk." "Won't anybody else look after her?" Jonathan replied. "I mean, it sounds all right for me to do it, but haven't you got any other family?" "None," said Susan. "Neither have we," Jonathan said. "There was a boy at my last school, Simon Potter. He had 5 uncles and 4 aunts and loads of cousins." "Ah, well," Susan said dreamily. "So, will you do it, Jonty?" "How much would the pay be?" Jonty could have kicked himself. That sounded so rude. But Susan merely smiled and said, "Shall we say 2 shillings a time? Does that sound fair?" It sounded more than fair. It sounded astonishing. 2 whole shillings just for sitting with an old woman. "Would I have to do anything while I'm with her?" "She likes to be read to from the newspaper and the occasional novel." He nodded. He could do that all right. "And she likes to knit, so you could hold the wool for her." That sounded easy peasy. "And you might have to make her a cup of tea." He'd done that often enough for his stepmother. "It all sounds fine," he said. "I'll just have to check with my father and see that he doesn't mind." "You'll let me know as soon as possible, then?" Susan sounded very grown up now. "I will. I'll call round tomorrow and tell you," Jonty said, feeling quite grown up himself. His father was going to be very late home that night, so in the end he asked his stepmother, hoping she wouldn't kick up a fuss. You could never tell what might make that happen, or say that he must wait for his father's permission. "I think it's a splendid idea, Jonty," she smiled a rare smile. "You'll have to make sure you mind your P's and Q's. Do your best to earn your pay, and make sure your hair's brushed and your nails are clean before you visit." "I will," said Jonty. This was wizard. He couldn't wait to get started. School broke up on a gloriously sunny day. On the very next one, the sky darkened, the wind got up,